Turn to 2 Corinthians 2. Wait, 2 Corinthians 12. 2 Corinthians 12. It is dubious, not profitable for me to boast. I will come to visions and revelations of the Lord. I know a man in Christ who 14 years ago, whether in the body or not, or whether out of the body, I do not know. God knew such as one was caught up to the third heaven. And I know such a man, whether in body or out of the body, I do not know. God knows. He was caught up into paradise and heard inexpressible words, which is not lawful for a man to utter. Of such a one I will boast, yet of myself I will not boast, except in my infirmities. So here he is. He's saying, it's not profitable for me to boast. He's saying this again. You know, he's saying, I shouldn't be boasting. But he says, there's a man, I will come to a vision of revelations of the Lord. So he's getting visions from the Lord, isn't he? He's getting revelations. And he goes on, he says, and I know of a man in Christ who 14 years ago, whether body or not, or whether out of the body, I do not know. God knew such one and was caught up in him to the third heavens. So at this time, he didn't know, was I in my body? Wasn't I in my body? Was this God just putting it in my mind, or was I actually there? It's like, oh, it feels like I'm actually there, but I'm not actually sure whether I was or not.
You had visions, right?
Yeah, it was such a clear vision that he didn't know whether he was there or not. But then he says, I was caught up into the third heaven. Now, the Bible does talk about this. The first heaven's here, second heaven's up in the earth, and then the third heaven will be heaven. Let's go to Revelations 21:1. And it says in Revelations 21:1, now I saw a new heaven and a new earth, for the first heaven and the first earth have passed away. Also, there was no more seas. So he saw a new heaven. So there's new heaven. And then he says, for the first heaven and the first earth passed away. So they actually pass away, don't they, when Revelation comes? That's what we're in now. And so there's other people who will say, no, he's talking about different heavens and that. It actually says, if you start going to Revelations, that it says about it, there's actually just the one heaven. And then, and it says in 2 Peter 3:7, but the heavens and earth which I now preserve by the same word are reserved for fire until the days of judgment and perdition of the ungodly man. So wait a minute. The heaven and earth we have now, what's going to happen? It's going to burn up in fire, isn't it? Mm-hmm. And then the real heaven's going to come down. We just happened to be talking about that the other day. And this is what's going to happen. So he's talking about the third heaven is where he was caught up in. And he said he didn't know where he was. Because he says in verse 4, how he was caught up in a paradise and heard inexpressible words, which is not lawful for a man to utter. Out of such one I will boast, yet of myself I will not boast except in my infirmities. So he's boasting about what he saw, isn't he? He's telling him, this is what God's vision was for me. I'm going to boast about God. I'm not going to boast about myself. It's going to be about God. He said, but except in my infirmities. So wait a minute. Infirmities is when you're hurting, isn't it? For though I might desire to boast, I will not be a fool. For I will speak the truth, but I refrain lest anyone who should think of me above what he sees me to be, or hears from me, at least I should be exalted above measures. My abundancy of revelations, a thorn in the flesh, was given to me, a message of Satan to buffet me, lest I be exalted above measures. Concerning these things, I plead with the Lord 3 times that it might be departed from me. So here's Paul, he's saying, if you know him, he's this little short guy, there's nothing impressive, there's really nothing to boast about. He's not a real good speaker. He knows what God's given him to do. And he's just going to speak the truth. He's not going to try to bluff his way out of it. But he says he has a thorn in his flesh. So he has a pain that won't go away. And he's asked God 3 times to take it away. 3 different times.
Probably more than that, for real.
Well, give him an answer. Because in verse 9 he says, and he said to me, my grace is sufficient for you, for my strength is made perfect in weakness. So wait a minute, God told him, my grace is sufficient for you. So when we have pain, we have to look at it as it's to remind us of what we're human, don't we? We're going to have pain. Here's Paul. And if one guy should know what pain is, he should know what pain is. He's been beaten almost to death. He's been whipped 5 different times. He's gone through a lot of pain, hasn't he? And he's saying, this is like a thorn in my side. So he's going through a lot of pain. He don't tell us what he had. Nobody knows what he had. But he's pleading for it to be taken away. And God says no. He said, my grace is sufficient. He wants him to rely on God, don't he? He says, my strength made perfect in weakness. When do we remember God the most? You see most people, when they're striving, they're making a lot of money and that, who do they forget about? God. When you're struggling, or you're in pain, or something serious happens, when do you remember? That's when you remember God, isn't it? There's a few people during the good times as well, but most of the time, it's during the hard times. It's when we have that thorn in our side, when we're hurt. That's when we make ourselves perfect, don't we? It's not during when everything's right. And that's what God's doing to him. He's making sure, because he said that, and he goes after, he said in the weakness, he goes, therefore mostly gladly I rather boast in my infirmities, that the power of Christ may rest upon me. So wait a minute, he's telling them about his problems with the side. But he says he's resting upon Christ. So he's giving it to God, isn't he? He's willing to take this pain, let people know that he's not no superpower, so he can show God better. And Paul is willing to do this for us, because he knows where his boasting comes from. He says that in verse 10, he says, therefore I take pleasure in infirmities, in reproaching, in needs, in persecution, in distress for Christ's sake. For when I am weak, then I am strong. So, when we're in Christ, when we are weak is when we have to stand the strongest for Christ, don't we? And that's when you know whether you're standing strong. You know, we always say, you don't really know where you stand as a Christian until you have to be persecuted for it. When you're weak and there's nothing you can do, and you have to say, yep, you know you're going to be beat or something, how many people are going to do that? But if you're willing to stand up, you're one of the strong ones, aren't you? Even though you might be weak at that time, you're going to get the beating or whatever. That's when you find out how strong your faith really is. It's in the weakness. It's during the hard times. It's during the trials. And every one of us are going to endure trials. And where are you going to stand? Are you going to let your weakness make you stronger? And that's what we're called to do. Let's go to prayer.